Now by microwave, Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa speaks with Charles Templeton in Toronto.
We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
Under the great hammer blows of homogenizing from the United States.
But all it took to enter the United States was a New York marketing expert and a campaign to make Moosehead an exotic specialty.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Red Ensign. This is the fourth iteration of the Red Ensign Live. As has been the tradition here, I'm going to use these live appearances to fill in when I don't have a guest or a co-host. And I'm going to catch up with a whole bunch of smaller items in the Canadian news and kind of notes on the publication. Later this week, maybe spilling into next week, will come out the interview I did with Benjamin Boyce on his channel. So you should all have a look for that. He asks a bunch of probing questions about the future of Canada. And we get into talking about the future of the online right, what used to be called the dissident right more generally. And I think you'll all find that kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it's the best quality work I've ever done, but people seem to like that kind of interview. The last one I did was very successful, and so go and have a look. So let's flip over the page to Canada. We're going to start by looking at a story we've been following going back before the Canadian election. So this channel discussed what we called the pivot, which was the anticipated effort by Canadian elites to recalibrate on migration in the post-Trudeau era. Now, to be clear, the expectation was not that we would get what viewers of this channel probably would like, a moratorium on migration and remigration, particularly of the temporary foreign workers in this country. But we expected the Canadian elite to try to, as we describe it, stick the landing between a hard reset on migration, the ensuing pretty hard dislocations in the Canadian economy that would be associated with that, and just a completely new course for the country. We expected them to stick the landing between that and between sort of pedal to the metal Century Initiative stuff. Now we have the first results of what's going on here coming out from StatsCan. So StatsCan shows the population of Canada flat plus 20,000 people in the first quarter. So what it looks like the Carney government has done is modulated migration down to a level where in-migration matches out-migration with an adjustment for the natural population decrease in the country, which is exactly what you would expect from a technocratic point of view if your goal was to stick the landing between causing a real estate crisis and alleviating the pressure on cost of living associated with migration. So they're doing exactly what you would expect them to have done. The problem they've got is that as this policy rolls on, to get to zero population growth, you're still looking at a couple of 100,000 net migrants into the country every year into Canada. Each one of those net migrants is a net tax drag, and so even from a technocratic point of view, this is a stopgap rather than a solution. Putting aside the the degradation to the identity of the country that kind of forms the backdrop of their power. So, it's what you would expect from the Carney government, but it's a complete failure to set a new course. What this is getting back to kind of the zero line, which is in itself kind of interesting. So that's the first item we want to catch up on. The next item we want to go through here is the title item for this stream, the soft lockdowns going on in throughout Atlantic Canada. And these have been different in different parts of Atlantic Canada. But in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, in Newfoundland, they're all struggling with hot, dry weather that has caused some wildfires, a bad wildfire season. Now, it's worth noting that if you look at forest management in Canada going back in like maybe 100-year history, something like 97% of Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces was logged, clear-cut between 1800 and 1950. The Atlantic region was clear-cut a little bit earlier and has a forest which cycles a little bit more quickly. So they're a little bit farther along this curve than we are in Ontario. But these forests, having been clear-cut between 70 and 150 years ago, are now in a state where they're mature again. And they're mature, but they're not. They have not been fire cycled. So in Ontario, what that looks like is, instead of a white pine dominated forest throughout the Canadian Shield region, you have a cedar and maple and oak dominated forest. Atlantic Canada is a little bit different depending on the spot, but the pattern is the same. The fire resistant species in the forest don't become dominant until the forest actually cycles through a couple of wildfires. So it takes a very long time for forests that have been clear cut to return to their natural condition and their natural speciation, which means that in this intermediate phase, when you've got a lot of regrowth but you have not gone through wildfire cycles, you have forests which are naturally very, very vulnerable to wildfires that get very severe and spread very quickly, even in years where in a forest that had not been disturbed it might have wildfires, but it wouldn't have severe wildfires in the sense that we've dealt with in this country over the last 15 or 20 years. Add to that the fact that the pulp and paper industry has declined substantially in Canada, and so a lot of the privately owned land in Atlantic Canada, which would have previously been managed for use in the pulp and paper industry, is going unmanaged as a result of the situation in that industry. You have a government which correctly predicts that you're going to have more severe wildfires in a wildfire season than you would have had for quite some time. All that to say, the solution to this kind of problem cannot be that it is illegal for Canadians to use the outdoors, right? So the solution they've arrived at in these three provinces is some combination of like severe jail time for breaking a fire ban, as well as really egregious fines. I think in Nova Scotia, the fine is $25,000 for going in the woods. And this includes going to the woods to go hiking, go fishing, go bird watching, all of these activities which are incredibly healthy and pro-social for Canadians to do. In Canada, one of the reasons we don't have quite as severe obesity problems as they have in the United States is because it's a big part of our culture to go and use the outdoor space, to go and challenge ourselves against the wilderness. It's one of the best parts of Canadian culture. It's something that our government should be promoting. And instead, we're going through a period of soft lockdown to deal with this problem. Now, in fairness to the Atlantic Canadian governments, because so much of this forest area is privately owned, it's very difficult for them to improve the forest management practices to kind of get this sorted out. So it's kind of an intractable problem. But we have to be, this is one of the few times that I will call to action for the audience. We have to be out there on social media almost every day, making the point that the solution to this difficult problem cannot be that it is illegal for Canadians to do inoffensive activities in the backwoods. The solution to climate activists causing wildfires, the solution to careless behavior from certain groups in the woods cannot be that the woods are off limits to regular Canadians. This is an integral part of our culture. It cannot be taken away from us in order to reduce wildfires. It's an unacceptable use of government power. And that message has to be loud. It has to be clear. The New Brunswick government has already gone through 3 different explanations for this ban. First, it was to prevent wildfires. Then people pointed out correctly, as I have done repeatedly, that walking in the woods does not cause wildfires. So the next version of their situation was emergency responder strain. So that if you break your leg while hiking, nobody's going in after you. Well, I don't know what it's like in Nova Scotia, but in most parts of Ontario, if you break your leg while hiking, emergency responders aren't going in after you anyway. You better hope you got good friends. Their latest version of this is that the wildfires might encircle you and you might get yourself killed. Well, again, part of Canadian wilderness culture is that you assume risks, whether it's bears, whether it's polar bears in the North Country. When you go into the part of what makes backwoods culture in Canada great is that it's a place of freedom and a place of personal responsibility, a place where you go prepared for all of the eventualities. None of this is acceptable. None of this is something that we can tolerate as Canadians, and we need to, make it a hard flex of government power rather than allow them to get away with, oh, this isn't the public interest, this is just us doing our job. So I will rarely call on the audience to do anything, but it's time to, but I really think that making this messaging uncomfortable for the Atlantic Canada premiers is something we can do without any real cost that will really improve the future of this country. So that's my exhortation for the day, I guess. So the next piece, another story that we've been following for quite a while, comes from La Belle Province. So the latest piece of news on this is that Maxime Bernier and the PPC are going to support the We campaign for the proposed PQ referendum. The actual story here is that the PQ in Quebec continue to move towards bringing another referendum on Quebec separation, a referendum that by polls should be razor edge once again. If we look at the Carney government, if we look at the actual check on Laurentian power in this country, they're facing now credible secession movements in the East and credible secession movements in the West, credible secession movements in Quebec. And so their behavior is disciplined by the need to deal with these regional push and pulls. I think given the low quality of our central government, it's quite reasonable to support movements towards de facto or even de jure separation, simply because reorganizing the country politically will realign the incentive structure of the elite which dominate it. I talked about this a little bit. I did an episode on corporate governance behind the paywall over on Cryptos' channel with a friend of mine, Ron Dodson. We talked extensively about the consequences of diverse ownership of the large corporations which dominate the American oligarchy, and the way that that diverse ownership structure creates an organized minority in management versus a disorganized majority in ownership. And so you have a classic situation where the organized minority of management dominates the corporation against the interest of the disorganized mass of ownership. Equally, because of the scale at which these organizations operate, you have a deterritorialization effect. One of the controversial positions of this channel is that I'm actually in favor of interprovincial trade barriers. I'm actually in favor of difficulty in operating businesses across Canada, because the more that you localize business interests, the more that you align the incentives of the corporate elite with the incentives of the people in the political jurisdiction in question. And so when I look at an issue like Quebec separatism, or Alberta separatism for that matter, it's not a clear-cut issue because it's very unclear what the politics of the resultant entity would be. But erecting barriers across Canadian territory that make trade more difficult, I think, will help in re-territorializing the interests of the elite, which ultimately dominate the country. And so I think that we should be qualified supporters of increased Quebec sovereignty and qualified supporters of increased Alberta sovereignty. I think there's a lot of incentive to disrupt the political status quo in the country. There's no better check in Canada on the power of the Laurentine elite than regionalism. It's a much more effective check than efforts at populism, which are very, very difficult in this country. I mean, I interviewed Daniel Tyree who runs the Dominion Society on this channel recently, and I appreciate everything he's trying to do, but the prospects for the project, the success of his project, are much worse than the prospects of checking Laurentine power and Laurentine ambition via regionalism, at least in the short term. So my view is that if you're involved if you're in Quebec, if you're in Alberta, you should be involved in regional nationalist politics to some degree. You should be careful about it because it's very possible that the central government decides that those politics are illegal at some point, and so you should watch carefully what's going on around you and decide when you should be involved and when you should not be involved. But there's a tremendous opportunity there to exert pressure to curb the abuses of the Canadian federal government. So that's that next story. We'll do 3 more, and then I'll come to the questions in the chat. So the next small item that I wanted to pick up is the canola tariffs that are being applied from China. So this week, the Chinese government applied a 76% tariff on canola coming from Canada. This is a straight trade dispute, as far as I can tell. To me, this is the greatest disappointment. Well, Trade is the greatest area of disappointment I have with the Carney government. They're in this position where they're caught between the Chinese government and the US government, who are both trying to kind of decouple from one another. And you see an emerging kind of new Cold War dynamic between the two of them. Canada has a big foot in the US camp and a little foot in the Chinese camp. Canada has neither taken one side or the other, nor successfully played one against the other. Instead, what we've gotten is punitive sanctions from both sides. So we have punitive tariffs applied by the Chinese government, we have punitive tariffs applied by the American government, and we're caught in the middle here. Canada is an export economy, and it's going to be an export economy for the foreseeable future, dominated by natural resources, agriculture, and the lumber industry. That's what it is. There's no prospect that that's changing in the short term, which means that putting Canada in a favorable geopolitical situation with trading partners that are consumers of these goods is the most important duty, which is federal jurisdiction. The Carney government came to power on the promise to manage this well, and has managed this so far disastrously. It's pathetic, and there's no politician who deserves more blame for this. So the Trudeau government got us into a poor position. The Carney government has failed to recover that position, is probably the best way to put it. But no Canadian should misunderstand the extent to which this is negatively affecting our prosperity as Canadians, and the extent to which this is the direct responsibility of the poor quality of leadership in this country. We should be in a highly favorable situation as a valued partner for both rival imperial blocs. Instead, we're in this tremendously negative position because our leadership just does not seem to understand that transforming Canada into a consumer economy is both undesirable in terms of the outcome for our people, but also impossible because of the actual dynamics that are associated with trying to bring large numbers of migrants in to drive the population up. It's a plan that's not going to work. It's a plan that should never have been started. It's a plan that should have been abandoned at every juncture, and it's a plan that our elites continue to pursue to our detriment, but also to their own detriment. So, and here we see another manifestation of this stupidity. The last story here, hang on, that's not the right screen. The last story here that we want to cover for this block, the Red Ensign, is the land title dispute in Richmond, British Columbia. So this went around the Twitter world very aggressively. So a BC court ruled that Native tribes have title to large areas of suburban developed Richmond, BC, very wealthy area. I had the resident legal analyst at the Red Ensign go through the rulings here to try to understand exactly what this means. First, understand that this is a lower court ruling that is likely to be challenged. And so if the ruling goes unchallenged, what will follow will be a negotiation between the British Columbia and federal government and the associated Native tribes over title to this area. If this ruling goes challenged, we may see it revisited. But in all of these land title disputes, Aboriginal title is not the same thing as private land ownership. So it's not as if the residents of Richmond, BC are going to be asked to abandon their homes for no compensation. Instead, what you'll see is the same situation you've seen over and over in Canada, where efforts to develop on this land, get building permits, build infrastructure, will all require a process called a process of consultation with the native tribes that hold title to it, and the native tribes will be able to effectively shake down these people for money every time they want to build something. This is what we see through many parts of Canada as a result of the titles which have been granted by various courts to native tribes associated with the treaties that were made by this country. My view is that this is an untenable situation for a sovereign country in the long term. It's got horrendous incentives, because the incentive for the native tribe is to use delay as their chief point of leverage in the negotiations. So they'll use their ability to delay the permitting process as a piece of leverage in order to get a deal which produces more revenue for the band that then goes down through the patronage network to pay all the activists. This is a very unhealthy dynamic for both sides. There are alternatives to running a country this way, and alternatives that involve a cooperative and healthy relationship with the native populations of the various parts of this country. We don't have to live like this. We shouldn't have to live like this. And I think we need to... I'm going to do a Red Ensign episode. Well, okay, we'll do this now. So what are some of the ways that you could handle this in a healthier way? Well, my favorite approach here is to force the various tribes to a choice. That choice is becoming independent sovereign countries and ceding territory to them, or becoming regular citizens of the country of Canada with the associated group of rights and no special rights. So if you think about it, the Canadian government often looks at Native Canadians as if they're a single entity. They're not. There's several hundred different tribal groups across the country, all of which are in fundamentally different situations. So if we look at the Six Nations Iroquois, it's very likely that if you approach them and said, we're prepared to cede a substantial part of your traditional territory as sovereign territory, you're going to be your own country, but there's customs and immigration and you're negotiating as a state with Canada. It's very likely that the result of that would be the independence of the Six Nations Iroquois. But it also means that those people would no longer get special access to Canadian universities. They would no longer get direct funding from the federal government of Canada. They would have to stand on their own 2 feet. All right. There would be appropriate social roles for the men in those communities, rather than these kind of nonsense activist roles attempting to negotiate the most favorable possible deal on the basis of their historic grievances against the Canadian government. Right. This solution both creates a single class of Canadian citizens that all have the same rights, no more free gas, no more tax-free smokes, no more any of that. But in exchange, these people will get back their real sovereignty and their real their self-respect and their agency to shape their own future. Now, on the other hand, there are a large number of Native American tribal groups that, if presented with the choice between sovereignty and its attendant responsibilities and regular Canadian citizenship, with the extractive relationship no longer on the table, would immediately become regular Canadian citizens by choice, right? Given that binary, given the end of privileged access to Canadian education at a reduced rate, all this other stuff that Native American groups get, given the binary between having to provide for themselves on the as a sovereign state versus the deal that regular Canadian citizens get, they would immediately become regular Canadian citizens. And there are variations on this kind of effort. But I really think that this is the path that a responsible government in Canada would go down, rather than this situation where you have this kind of, where you have this concept of Aboriginal title, where the Native American group gets something like the powers of a municipality over territory that they fundamentally don't control. Instead, you get to a rationalized system. And maybe Canada has 13 fragment states that it's got to deal with, but microstates work very well in lots of places in the world where defense is not a concern. And I just don't see that there would be any problem going down this path, except that a lot of activists would lose their job and people would have to do productive things instead of engaging in this kind of extortion racket. And the Canadian courts could focus on actual crime instead of resolving these ridiculous disputes. So that's my view on the issue of reconciliation. I think that's the direction that we need to go in. And I think that the historic view of the Canadian government that they should maximize their territorial claims has had this kind of poison fruit of claiming territory that they never really controlled, and therefore therefore this kind of this kind of ridiculous situation where territory that the Canadian government never really controlled in the Northwest is claimed as part of Canada. They try to levy taxes on it, but then they assume responsibility for the groups that actually live there as kind of wards of the state. None of this ever... This was not a good plan. Instead, the de facto reality on the ground that these areas were native territory should have been acknowledged, and they should have been treated as sovereign entities. So that's my view on the matter. And the more that we get the legal structure to line up with that de facto reality, instead of playing these games, the more that Canada will be able to focus on doing actually productive things rather than having these kind of what economists would call rent-seeking behaviors that are very profitable for the individuals involved, but fundamentally unproductive. All right, let's have a look at the chat and see if there's any questions here worth addressing. There isn't much. Let's see. Let's have a look at the Twitter chat. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot here that I'd like to address. The last item that was on the agenda is the Great Flame War between Bronze Age pervert and the religious and traditional part of the online right, of which I was a due participant. Couple of thoughts here that I want to that are relevant to Canada, relevant to the right broadly internationally. One of the things which has become very obvious in the 21st century is that meeting the physical needs of a group of people, wealth, sustenance, etc., and even meeting them on a generational scale is not enough for people to live for. In Canada, we're in a different situation than a lot of places in that our standard of living has actually started to decline quite a bit in the last 20 years. But through most of the Western world, standards of living are a lot better today than they were in the immediate post-war period. Famine is not a concern. You don't have the gas shortages of the 70s. People are housed in places with air conditioning, with heating, with proper appliances. A lot of these things could not be said in the post-war period in places like Europe, in places like Korea, in places like Japan. And yet, people are kind of committing genetic suicide. They refuse to have children. They refuse to engage in society productively. And they are doing things which are antithetical to the long-term future of their civilization. They're people, and it gets at this kind of underlying problem in modernity, and that is that a full belly is not enough. People have real meaning needs, and the Open Society project undermined the traditional sources of meaning that defined people's lives, and as a result, people perceive their lives as having no meaning and no purpose, and therefore no reason to continue, no place in a great chain connected to the past and the future. And so this part of society is dying for lack of purpose. And so you've had critics of this system emerge on the right and on the left, and one of the very first critics to emerge on the right, recognizably on the right, was Bronze Age Pervert when he wrote the book Bronze Age Mindset. And the powerful insight that is in Bronze Age Mindset is that in order to understand the problems of modernity, you ought to place yourself in the perspective of people from another time, another culture, and try to see yourselves, your own culture, through those eyes to try to understand what's wrong with it. And so Bronze Age Pervert takes up the perspective of of Greek paganism to try to look at modernity. And his immediate critique is that modernity suffers from effeminacy and is denied. It's basically an Uncle Ted critique, right? He's got different words. He's got this, very impressive rhetorical style to drive home these points, but he's basically critiquing the modern man as a domesticated animal, separated from purpose and agency, which is what you would immediately. It's an accurate rendering of the perspective that a pagan Greek would have had. I mean, if you look at the pre-Roman Greeks, they viewed the Persians as slaves because of their relationship with their kings, right? They would have exactly the same perspective on modern Western peoples, that they're just like really, really well-fed, but purposeless sort of cattle populations. The problem with Bronze Age Pervert, on the other hand, is that his perspective, his metaphysical perspective, the one that he owns rather than the one he adopts, is that of like a 2004 era big man on campus, right? So if you remember back to this era, all the best students at this time were atheists. They really enjoyed the sport of dunking on sort of what they viewed as low-class Christians on campus. They enjoyed participating in the performance of the progressives defeating their enemies in these kind of lopsided games. That world no longer exists, right? If Bronze Age Pervert was going back to campus in 2025, he would find himself the hunted and not the hunter, right? And not only that, there's no way to turn back time and go back to the world that he enjoyed. And so he finds himself in this situation where the class he used to prey on, he used to enjoy participating in the sport of mocking, is one of the competing blocks for power in the factional game that's going on in the U.S. And so you have this dynamic, which I'm sure is very frustrating for him, where the same people who immediately took up his critique, yeah, modernity really is meaningless, yeah, we should adopt a pre-modern frame, are all adopting their frame of choice is the pre-modern frame from their own tradition rather than the pre-modern frame from Greek paganism. And he doesn't like the results very much. He mocks them as trads and calls them long-housed and whatever. This is ridiculous. Greek and Roman paganism died for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons why it died is it had an unsustainable relationship between men and women, one that couldn't withstand civilization above a certain level, because once safety was assured, the justification for that relationship was gone. And so once you put up the city walls, then suddenly the fact that your husband is an effective barbarian no longer really counts for anything. That's why that perspective died. That's why I have my view is that it's also fundamentally untrue, right? Worshipping false gods of wood and stone is just it's silly. Even looking back at the Greek literature, I don't find it nearly as impressive as the literature produced by Christendom. My unapologetic view is that Shakespeare is better than Homer, and then it's not close. It's not close. And so he finds himself in this interesting war where he is fighting for the values of pre-Christian civilization against the values of Christian civilization, and it's a fight that, in my view, he's going to and should lose. So, welcome to the EDREM of the online right. There's some really interesting things that you can learn from him. He's much more talented than I will ever be, but I think I don't apologize for my perspective on the matter. All right. There's a question in the chat. Is it possible for Quebec to re-Christianize? That's an interesting question. So is it possible in the long term? Of course it's possible in the long term. All kinds of things happen in 100 and 200 year frames, or happen by very unusual historical processes. My view, if you look at how Quebec de-Christianized, it de-Christianized by a kind of preference cascade led by its elite. I see no prospect that the Quebecois elite are going to re-Christianize Quebec as a part of a preference cascade. I see no evidence that they're returning to God in my personal dealings in Quebec. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't have a complete view. So I don't see Quebec returning to Christianity as part of a preference cascade. My view is that they're increasingly a race-first there's kind of a race-first nationalism that has a lot of currency in Quebec, and that they kind of pretend that it's about language and culture, but it really isn't. It's about race. And you can think what you want to think about that, but that's my view of the actual situation down there. All right. Thanks very much for your time and attention. I will continue to do these as kind of a heartbeat when to keep the channel and keep the podcast going when I don't have a guest or a co-host or a particular topic. But let me know in the comments if you think that this model of addressing a whole bunch of small stories in the discourse is interesting and worth doing. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your Canadian summer. It's later than you think.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.